This video you're watching is my diagnosis of a CAN B network failure, and it actually had a short, and we're going to discuss that in this video. I proceeded to remove the horn fuse to get rid of the honking, and I also made sure that removing that fuse did not cause any actual trouble codes or anything like that, and it didn't affect the diagnosis in any way. Now the power windows work. All this seems to be working. Our instrument cluster, most of it works. In fact, it seems to all be working, but I notice the outside temperature showing dashes. But looking at the wiring diagram, a lot of this stuff is still hardwired inputs like the fuel sender, stuff like that. Make sure you check your fuses. Owner's manual is real helpful, though most people don't keep them. Somebody's been in here before. This retaining clip for the side panel was broken, and the screw's backed out. I always like to check the cabin air filter. In this case, there was a small nest, and you see some chewing here, but that's not concrete evidence just yet, so keep that in mind. Looking at this code chart that Honda provided in their service information, which I had to pay for, there's a chart that's very helpful, and it shows basically that the modules that are responsible for transmitting and receiving specific trouble codes. And it's a cross-reference chart. If you look at these two codes here, they're the same two exact codes that I had and no other codes. So what that tells me early on is that I very likely have a loss of communication on the entire CAN network. B is the network that it's called, which is the interior bus. Now the K line is for diagnostic communications for the scan tool communicating with certain modules. The FCAN is powertrain, engine module, ABS, etc., etc. This is kind of a diagram I put together of the B network, and it's not everything, but it's some of the main modules on that network. I also plugged in, like the trouble chart recommended, and I verified that I could not communicate with my B CAN network. All right, we've got incorrect voltage on the DBOM for CAN high and low, green and white wires to the gauge. That has loss of comm. We had 10 volts on the voltmeter. This is what it looks like on the picoscope. We have a very poor looking signal. So that's not a short to ground. That's a cross short to power somewhere, either in the wiring or a module. Also wanted to add that the instrument cluster is a gateway, so we have multiple module network types going through this one component. So the key is on. We have 10 volts. Turn the key off, and we still have 10 volts. Let's look at the resistance. 60 ohms. I'm checking it at another BCAN module. Now, that's not the only thing I need to check. I also need to check it to a power source, battery disconnected, and a ground source to see if there's any evidence of cross-shorting. So check at the ground first. And I've got about 6,000 ohms. All right, to a power source, we have about 12,000 ohms. So far, you wouldn't think that there's a cross short to a power source or cross short to another circuit on the CAN bus, but there may be. And how do we know that? And this cross short could be happening inside a module. It could be someone spilt something or water dripped into a module or a connector. This is where the picoscope comes in really handy. All right,
Alright, as you can see, still got a 10-volt bias. Key's been off a long time. Bunch of modules disconnected. Kind of went through the list. Got hours into this job. Just figuring out where everything's at is a big hurdle. Alright, so disconnect this connector here, which leads to the back power liftgate module. That's a jumper harness or junction harness connector. Separate the dash harness and the floor harness. You see there, drop to 0 volts. So what I'm going to do now is plug in the main operating modules like the cluster and the MICU radio display and see if things start coming back to life to indicate I need to rip that whole back of the car apart to get to that single module and check it. Might be rodent damage, might be a bad module, might be a cut wire. Okay, we're starting to get a more correct signal. I've only got the immobilizer module and the column plugged in and the MICU at the dash under dash fuse box. And so those two are plugged in, but probably have this signal looking like this, which isn't 100% correct due to the fact that we may not have correct resistance in the circuit with all these modules disconnected, specifically terminating resistance. Now you see that the CAN bus voltage is closer to 2 volts now, so that's looking good. Now I still have a bunch of modules disconnected. Let's check it for terminating resistance, the battery disconnected, and also resistance to ground. All right, we got 25,000 ohms with only the MICU and the immobilizer module plugged in. Checking CAN B to load, a CAN B high. So somewhere in the system we have terminating resistors built into the module. Unfortunately, Honda does not tell you which ones, but this is why we had poor CAN bus signal on the scope. Way better than it was with that connector unplugged going to the rear hatch module system, but it's still not the correct resistance. Should be around 60 ohms, pretty exact to that. Okay, I plugged in this dominant module on the CAN B network, which is an interior network, and now I have 120 ohms. Okay, we got 60 ohms. As soon as I plugged in the rear hatch circuit network connector with the light green and white B-CAN network wires going to that system in the back for the rear hatch, we went to proper terminating resistance. Only problem is I can't leave it plugged in because we have basically a short to voltage on that rear circuit into the B-CAN system. So I've got to leave it disconnected. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, we got 10 volts on CAN B network, all modules plugged in, so that's incorrect. Go ahead and disconnect this jumper to the rear hatch system, and our voltage goes to proper voltage. We're not going to have we're going to have 60 ohms instead of 120 ohms. May not be enough to properly communicate with all the other modules, since unfortunately the rear hatch circuit is a dominant module with terminating resistor of 120 ohms inside. To help proper signal, it helps create a proper signal, basically that resistance of 60 ohms. So 120 is better than 5,000 like you saw at the beginning, but still might not be enough for the signal. We're going to use the scope and find out. We have 2.5 volt bias now instead of 10 volts. We have a good looking CAN signal, all because we disconnected the rear hatch system by undoing this connector up front. So it could be any of the wiring in the floor here, all the way up to the module in the back where the rear hatch module is at. Unfortunately, difficult to get to. All that trim has to come off. But we have temperature display now. This display is coming on. If we scan it, all these modules should come back up. We gotta proceed to figure out how to get to that rear hatch module next. Yeah, so sometimes you might get bit by a rattlesnake while you're working on cars. I hope I don't get bit. Okay, gotta start ripping the back of the car apart. Took a while just to get the hatch open. There's the access panel, because the rear hatch system is electronic and wouldn't operate with the CAN network down. I was able to get my hand way up in here and disconnect the rear hatch module, and the short is still there. After I disconnected there, plugged in up front, short came back on the CAN network. So somewhere in this harness we have a problem. Probably chewed on wires, but we're about to find out after we spend a bunch of time ripping this whole seat system out. All this wiring, it has to be checked, because we disconnected that jumper harness up front and the problem went away, but disconnected the module before we pulled all this trim and the problem was still there, indicating wiring. So we gotta figure out where the problem is. Okay, we have continuity, really high continuity in the millions, cross shorting to this CAN wire. Only one of the CAN wires. I'm gonna pull the terminal out, see if it still has continuity to eliminate cross trace from oxidation in the connector or outside of this harness. About the only way I can think of doing it. And then we gotta find out where the water's coming in. So we have a water leak problem. The two connectors above it going to the door harness actually have water in them. What's really strange is I couldn't see any oxidation on that connector. I'm still gonna rule it out just because we've gone this far with it, but yeah, you see the water droplet in that one terminal. Okay, we got water that was in these connectors causing CAN network issue. Cleaned them out with deoxit, some solutions, verified no more cross resistance. Dealer probably would have replaced both the body harness and dash harness, and then may or may not have noticed water in those connectors. Maybe they would have let it go. I've seen it before at the dealer. They don't like to clean out connectors, they just like to replace harnesses. And I guess you don't blame them. Sometimes it's a safer way, but there are solutions to get the corrosion out of the harnesses without replacing a whole expensive electrical harness. So next step, find out where the water comes in from. There's got to be a problem there. We now have the modules communicating. We don't have any codes at all, but you see these modules say no response. It says no response because they're not options the vehicle has. I'm not concerned because we don't have any codes saying lost comm at all in any of the modules, and that's kind of my base rule is, okay, we don't have those modules. And I know it doesn't have those modules because before we had a loss of comm in at least one of the modules. We no longer have that, so a little helpful tip for you.